What if some of the biggest legends you remember from wrestling's golden age never really left, and instead walked straight into a completely different era, adapting, surviving, and sometimes even thriving when everything around them had already changed? Imagine the faces you grew up watching in the bright, larger-than-life world of 1980s WWF suddenly appearing again in the early 2000s, when wrestling had become faster, darker, and far more intense. That crossover didn't just happen once or twice, it happened repeatedly, and the results were often unforgettable. Because while eras in wrestling are usually treated like clean breaks, reality is far messier. Stars overlap, legends linger, and sometimes the past refuses to stay in the past. And that's exactly what makes this journey so fascinating. Today, we're diving into a group of iconic names from wrestling's golden era who somehow still found their way into the Ruthless Aggression Era, leaving behind one more chapter in careers already filled with history. And we might as well begin with one of the biggest names the business has ever seen. When you think of 1980s wrestling, one figure stands above almost everything else in terms of recognition, charisma, and pure mainstream impact. Hulk Hogan wasn't just a wrestler during the Golden Era, he was the Golden Era's identity. Hulkamania turned him into a global phenomenon, a larger-than-life hero who stood at the center of WWF's explosion in popularity. Alongside names like Macho Man Randy Savage and The Ultimate Warrior, he helped define an entire generation, but it was always clear that Hogan was the flag bearer. For years, his image and the WWF Championship felt inseparable. He was the face on posters, the main event at the biggest shows, and the name that brought casual fans into wrestling arenas. But by the early 1990s, even Hulkamania started to feel the weight of time. The character had been at the top for so long that audiences began to crave something new. That shift eventually led Hogan away from WWF into WCW, where he would reshape himself again. But wrestling has a way of bringing people back. In 2002, right as WWE was transitioning into what would become the Ruthless Aggression Era, Hulk Hogan made a shocking return. At first, he wasn't the hero fans remembered. He came back as Hollywood Hogan, the black-clad, villainous version tied to the NWO era. But everything changed at WrestleMania 18 in his match against The Rock. The crowd reaction that night didn't just surprise people, it forced a complete shift. Fans weren't ready to boo him. They were still in love with him. WWE responded quickly, turning him babyface again and giving him one more run at the top. That run included a memorable victory over Triple H for the Undisputed Championship, proving that even in a completely new era, Hulk Hogan's name still carried weight. He also stepped into the ring with Vince McMahon at WrestleMania 19 and crossed paths with rising stars like Kurt Angle. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was proof that Hulk Hogan could still exist in a new wrestling world and matter. If Hogan was the hero of that era, then Roddy Piper was the chaos that made heroes feel real. Roddy Piper was never just an opponent, he was an experience. In the Golden Era, he wasn't simply a villain fans wanted to see lose, he was someone who made audiences emotionally invested in everything he touched. His energy, unpredictability, and sharp tongue made him one of the most effective antagonists WWF had ever seen. Without Piper, Hulk Hogan's rise wouldn't have hit nearly as hard. Piper wasn't just tied to Hogan's success, though. He carved out a legacy of his own, headlining the first WrestleMania, stepping into one of wrestling's most infamous boxing matches against Mr. T at WrestleMania 2, and hosting the legendary Piper's Pit, where chaos seemed to follow him everywhere. He also proved he wasn't just talk. His match against Bret Hart at WrestleMania 8 showed he could still tell a story inside the ring, not just outside it. Like many stars of his generation, Piper eventually drifted into WCW, seemingly closing the book on his WWF run. But in 2003, during WrestleMania 19, he reappeared during the legendary Hulk Hogan vs. Vince McMahon storyline. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was a reminder that Piper was one of the foundation pieces of WrestleMania itself. And even in the Ruthless Aggression Era, he still had something left. His microphone work remained sharp, almost dangerous, and he even captured tag team gold alongside a familiar veteran presence. He may have been older, but the mind, the voice, and the attitude were still unmistakably Roddy Piper. Then comes a name who often defines wrestling greatness itself, Ric Flair. While many fans associate Ric Flair most strongly with NWA and WCW, his impact in WWE spans multiple eras. The Nature Boy's legacy was already fully formed before he ever set foot in WWF. Robes, championships, 16 world title reigns, and a reputation built on excellence, arrogance, and unmatched storytelling ability in the ring. His first WWF run in 1991 was legendary in its own right. Arriving with the WCW World title and calling himself the real world champion, Flair instantly felt like a foreign force invading WWE. It built toward one of the most anticipated dream matches in history, Ric Flair versus Hulk Hogan. While that WrestleMania 8 clash never happened, Flair's 1992 Royal Rumble victory, where he entered at number 3 and went the distance to win the WWF Championship, remains one of the greatest performances in the match's history. Even without the Hogan match, Flair proved he could adapt anywhere. After returning to WCW, Flair's WWE story seemed finished until 1991 when WCW collapsed and WWE acquired its talent. He returned as part owner on screen, but soon enough he was back in the ring again during the Ruthless Aggression Era. Despite his age, he still delivered memorable performances, including championship success and intense matches with modern stars. One of his most emotional and respected performances came at WrestleMania 28 against Shawn Michaels, a match that felt like a farewell wrapped in storytelling perfection. By the end of it, he had done what few others could, remain relevant across entirely different wrestling generations. And speaking of generational connections, Dusty Rhodes represents something even more unique. Dusty Rhodes is often remembered as a symbol of NWA greatness, but his connection to WWF in the late Golden Era created something special, not just for himself, but for his son, Dustin Rhodes. When Dusty arrived in WWF in 1989, he brought Dustin with him, a young wrestler still finding his identity in the shadow of a legendary father. At that time, he was just beginning, learning the ropes in an environment far bigger than anything he had experienced. While he wasn't yet the polished performer fans would later recognize, those early appearances mattered. They gave him exposure, experience, and a foundation that would shape his entire career. Eventually, Dustin evolved in WCW, showing real promise and stepping out of his father's shadow. But his most defining transformation came in WWF during the New Generation era when he became Goldust. The character was unlike anything fans had ever seen, strange, provocative, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Even as the 1990s shifted back and forth between companies, Goldust remained a constant presence in some form. By the time the Ruthless Aggression Era arrived, the character had evolved again, becoming more comedic and flexible, adapting to the tone of the time. One of his most memorable partnerships came with Booker T, an odd couple tag team that somehow worked perfectly, producing some of the most entertaining segments of that era. It proved Dustin wasn't just a gimmick, he was a performer capable of reinventing himself repeatedly. Then comes Bob Orton Jr., a name that may not always sit at the top of Golden Era discussions, but still holds historical significance. Bob Orton Jr. was part of WrestleMania 1, standing in the corner of Roddy Piper and playing his role in one of wrestling's most important events. He also spent years as a reliable in-ring presence, often facing Hulk Hogan in house show circuits and helping build WWF's touring success during the 1980s. His return in the Ruthless Aggression Era came through his son, Randy Orton. By 2005, Bob reappeared during Randy's infamous Legend Killer storyline involving The Undertaker, even teaming with his son in a handicap match. It was brief, but it connected two eras in a very direct way. Greg the Hammer Valentine also represents that same bridge between generations. A tough, respected competitor from WWF's Golden Era, Valentine held the Intercontinental Championship and worked across major programs, including his infamous dog collar match with Roddy Piper in JCP. While not always a main event star, he was a dependable force throughout the 1980s. By the mid-2000s, after being inducted into the Hall of Fame, he made brief appearances in WWE, including a match on Heat against Rob Conway. Small moments, but enough to place him within both eras' timelines. The Road Warriors, Hawk and Animal, are another unforgettable case. As one of the most dominant tag teams in wrestling history, they defined intensity wherever they went. Known globally as unstoppable forces, they arrived in WWF in 1990 as the Legion of Doom and immediately became one of the most feared teams in the company. They captured tag team gold and maintained their reputation as powerhouses. but their WWE journey was always intermittent. By 2003, they returned briefly during the Ruthless Aggression Era, including a Raw match against Kane and Rob Van Dam. Tragically, Hawk's passing soon after gave their story a somber tone. Animal continued briefly with different partners, but it was never the same. Their legacy, however, remained untouched. Marty Jannetty represents another emotional connection between eras. As part of the Rockers with Shawn Michaels, Jannetty helped define one of the most exciting tag teams of the late 1980s. Fast-paced, flashy, and innovative, they stood out immediately. But as Shawn Michaels rose, Jannetty struggled with consistency and personal challenges. His most famous moment remains the infamous barbershop window incident, where his split with Michaels became legendary. Years later, in 2005, he returned unexpectedly to WWE, even reuniting with Michaels briefly and appearing in segments against La Resistance and others. It wasn't a major run, but it placed him once again inside WWE's evolving world. Mr. Perfect, Curt Hennig, is another name that bridges eras effortlessly. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Mr. Perfect represented technical excellence, charisma, and flawless presentation. Whether feuding with Hulk Hogan or delivering classic matches against Bret Hart, he consistently performed at an elite level. His 2002 Royal Rumble return shocked fans, especially as he lasted until the Final Four alongside names like Steve Austin, Triple H, and Kurt Angle. It was a reminder that even after years away, his talent hadn't disappeared. He continued briefly afterward, working with rising stars like Randy Orton before his untimely passing in 2003. And finally, Tatanka closes this journey. Debuting in the early 1990s, Tatanka quickly became known for his undefeated streak and powerful babyface presentation. He defeated numerous opponents without losing for nearly 3 years, creating one of the most respected early streaks of that era. His momentum eventually slowed after his first major loss in 1994, and he left WWE in 1996. But in 2005, he returned during the Ruthless Aggression Era. While no longer undefeated or heavily pushed, he still contributed as a veteran presence until his departure in 2007. And, in the end, that's what ties all of these names together. Different eras, different styles, different levels of success, but each of them carried a piece of wrestling's golden age into a completely new world, proving that in wrestling, true legacies never really disappear.